Hello, welcome to Unit 4 of our course. I look forward to working with you. This unit addresses a number of different themes. It addresses the presidency of Andrew Jackson, the Bank of the United States, also social class in American history, and it addresses the development of the American political system. So I'd like to introduce and briefly comment upon these themes in this short introductory video. I do want to mention that you have 2 assignments to complete for this week, in addition to your regular reading assignment. In terms of the reading assignment, you're asked to read Boundless chapters 9, 10, and 11. The 2 written assignments include the discussion board. For the discussion board, you're asked to comment upon a short reading. Andrew Jackson served as President of the United States. He was one of the most controversial presidents in American history. And Andrew Jackson vetoed a bill to reauthorize the Bank of the United States. You're asked to read a short text of his justification for his veto, and then to write a discussion board commentary reflecting on the significance of social class in American history. So that's one assignment. The second assignment is a blog post. And for the blog post, you're asked to watch a short video about the bitterness of the campaign between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and then to comment upon political campaigns in American history in your blog post. So those are the 2 written assignments for this week. So I'd like to comment on each of these issues. Andrew Jackson was the first presidential candidate to launch a mass campaign, a popular campaign for the presidency. All previous candidates for president had tried to appeal only to a small elite. It's important to remember that in early American history, the right to vote was severely restricted. From 1789 up through 1820, even 1824, in order to vote, you had to be a man who owned property. And when I say owned property, owned a significant amount of land. A majority of white men could not vote. You had to have sizable land holdings in order to vote. Therefore, there was no need, there was no reason to appeal to large crowds of people to campaign for their votes. Presidential candidates only had to appeal essentially to wealthy landowners for their votes. However, in the 1820s, the laws begin to change, and by 1824 and ultimately by 1828, a number of states have changed the law to bring about universal suffrage for white men. In other words, white men could now vote regardless of whether they owned property or not. And this radically changed American politics. Suddenly, there was an incentive for American candidates, presidential candidates, and others to appeal to people who, for example, were poor or who were working class, who didn't have a lot of money. And Andrew Jackson was really the first candidate to successfully do so. And as a result, he often spoke about issues of social class. He argued that our country was dominated by a small elite of wealthy businessmen, bankers, landholders, and that the American economic system was fundamentally corrupt. Jackson liked to present himself as a man of the people. In truth, this was not entirely accurate. Jackson, in fact, did have substantial land holdings himself. He did own slaves. It is true that he was born in a humble background he was orphaned as a teenager. Both of his parents, well, his father died when he was quite young. His mother died when he was a teen during the Revolutionary War, so he was orphaned young, and he didn't have much money growing up. He had no real formal education, but certainly he did become quite a wealthy man prior to his running for president. He had been a general in the American military prior to his running for president. So he was hardly a sort of he tried to present himself though as a sort of everyman, a common man of the people. That was the persona that he tried to create for himself, certainly. And when you read the document, you'll see that he appeals to this. So the issue that's discussed in the document is Andrew Jackson's veto of the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States was the central bank for the country. The Bank of the United States was an idea that Alexander Hamilton had first proposed decades earlier. It was a central bank for the country, and it served as a central depository bank for the U.S. government. The Bank of the United States served a variety of important functions. It basically set interest rates for all other financial institutions in the country. The Bank of the United States was a precursor to what today we would call the Federal Reserve. It's not exactly the same, but it's an important sort of predecessor to what today we would regard as the Federal Reserve System. It helped to provide stability for the banking system in the United States. Andrew Jackson, though, viewed the Bank of the United States as a deeply corrupt institution. The Bank of the United States had private investors, both American investors and foreign investors, and he always believed that this bank operated to promote the interests of the wealthy at the detriment of the interests of the, quote, common man. And he was deeply opposed to continuing to support this institution. Jackson's political opponents argued that shutting down the Bank of the United States would create economic chaos, that without a central bank, there would be no institution to establish a baseline for interest rates, there would be no institution to issue federal currency, and that the entire banking system would become dangerously unregulated, essentially. Jackson, though, rejected these arguments. Jackson was fundamentally opposed to the notion of a centralized institution to regulate banking, and hence he vetoed the bill to reauthorize the Bank of the United States. A veto, it's rarely used, but occasionally used by a president. When Congress passes a bill, the president can choose either to sign the bill into law or to veto the bill, to reject it. If the president vetoes the bill goes back to Congress. Congress can override the presidential veto, but only with a 2/3 majority vote in both houses of Congress, which is very rare. It's very difficult to achieve, to override the veto. If the veto is not overridden, the bill is rejected and it does not become law. Just recently there was a veto. Congress recently passed a law allowing families of the victims of the September 11th attacks to file lawsuits against the nation of Saudi Arabia. President Obama vetoed the bill, and Congress in this case actually did override the president's veto, which is very unusual. But going back to this Bank of the United States instance, Andrew Jackson vetoes the reauthorization of the Bank of the United States. Congress did not have the votes to override his veto, and therefore the Bank of the United States had to close. It was not authorized to continue in operation. And the predictions of Jackson's political opponents did, in fact, prove to be true. there was a financial panic that resulted from the closing of the Bank of the United States. There was now no institution to effectively regulate interest rates for the nation. There was now no supervisory institution to manage financial markets. And many argue that the closing of the Bank of the United States helped, well, ushered in a recession, a serious economic crisis in the country. So I think most historians today would argue that Jackson's decision to close the Bank of the United States was unwise, was not a good decision. It raises broader issues concerning class in America, social class. In the United States, we would like to believe that we live in an egalitarian, equal society. We've rejected the notions of nobility that existed in Europe, where you could be born as either a noble person or a commoner based on the status of one's parents. We don't have a class of nobles like there was, say, in England or France. But of course, there are great disparities of wealth in the United States. We all know that, and that's been true since early American history. There have been social class divisions throughout American history. If you go back to the earliest settlement in colonial America, Jamestown, founded in 1607, the Virginia colony, all of the southern colonies, in fact, had very great disparities of wealth, even prior to the American Revolution. Most of the settlers of the southern colonies were either wealthy landowners who were bringing over servants and slaves, or were indentured servants or slaves themselves. So you had very little middle class in the American South in the colonial period. The people who were coming to colonial America were either coming to acquire large tracts of land as plantations, or were coming as either indentured servants or slaves to work on those plantations. So there's very little middle class. There were individuals who were poor and unfree, either temporarily or permanently, and individuals who were quite wealthy. Now, in the North, the situation was somewhat different. If you look at, say, colonial New England, you did have more of a middle class. You had families coming over to establish small farms. You had a merchant class. There did emerge disparities of wealth, certainly, over time. You did see the emergence of a wealthy merchant class in places like Boston and New York, and large landholders, certainly, as well, across the region of New England. And some groups fell into poverty as well. And there was slavery, of course, in the colonial era, and even in early U.S. history in the Northeast as well. But you had a broader class division in the North. You had a range of classes, from individuals who were deeply impoverished, individuals who were enslaved, through a working class, a middle class, and a wealthy class of landholders and merchants. So you had many different class stratifications in the North. So social class has been a matter of concern, of significant concern throughout American history. Now, in Andrew Jackson's period in the 1820s, 1830s, America's becoming more and more a consumer economy, a cash economy. You're seeing a flourishing of industry, of trade, of commerce. In Massachusetts and New York, you have industries, textile factories, you have a growing business class, a growing merchant class. So by the 1820s, 1830s, commerce is flourishing in America. You have the development of a canal network. You see the Erie Canal developing. There's a rise in commerce, the exchange of goods for profit, both between communities, between states, and on the international scene, the international marketplace. So you do see a flourishing of a sort of middle class, upper business class, especially in the northern states. This middle class became interested in social reform. It was the middle class that pushed really social reform movements in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. Most were most of the middle class were evangelical Protestants. Many were pushing moral reform movements. Among these were temperance, trying to either push for the abolition of the consumption of alcohol or movements to restrict consumption of alcohol. There were movements to create dry counties where alcohol wouldn't be sold. Some campaigned against all alcohol, some only against hard liquor. There were campaigns organized by the growing middle class to clean up cities, to close gambling halls, to make prostitution illegal. There were campaigns organized by the middle class to promote sort of civic virtue, if you will. So the middle class was a driver also behind founding more public schools, and also creating a lot of reformatory institutions, orphanages, asylums for the mentally ill, prisons for criminals, all of which had the goal of reforming individuals, to make individuals, to transform the nature of the individual, to take a person who is engaging in sin and to make them a better person was the idea. So social class distinctions you do see certainly as an important factor in American history. The period that we're looking at, the 1820s, 1830s, this is before the huge waves of migration that we'll see later, bringing in immigrants from Europe. You see this really starting in the 1840s, 1850s. The first big wave of European immigrants to enter will be the Irish immigrants will enter due to the Irish potato famine. And that will bring a large wave of deeply impoverished immigrants from Europe into the United States, and will raise certainly new debates about social class in America as well. Political campaigns, which I think is an interesting topic given that we're in a political campaign season now, and a political campaign season that I think is very unusual and has somewhat bizarre at times as well. One of the interesting things that you're going to look at this week is the fact that political campaigns have actually been fairly ugly at many points in American history. We would like to think that the political campaigns of the past were more regal and civil and high-minded. Unfortunately, that's not entirely true. That the political campaigns of the past oftentimes were pretty ugly. And if you look back on it and look at the material that was published in the past and the attack ads that were published in the past, a lot of them were as bad as the campaign ads of the present, if not even worse at times. So politics has always been pretty ugly business, unfortunately, and I think it's interesting to reflect upon that. And that's what the blog post assignment asks you to do. So you're going to watch a short video. It's only about a minute and a half in length, minute 45 seconds in length, and it takes actual quotations from political ads from the campaign of John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, this was really the first hotly contested political campaign for president in American history. Prior to this, George Washington was president. No one really contested his election. He was so popular that it was a sort of foregone conclusion that he would be elected. John Adams was George Washington's vice president. Thomas Jefferson was also a prominent figure in his cabinet. They were, though, from competing now political parties. John Adams represented the Federalist Party. Thomas Jefferson represented the Republican Party. They were at odds with each other. They had very different views about the future. John Adams envisioned the future of America as an urban industrial nation with a strong central government. That was the Federalist platform. Thomas Jefferson envisioned the future of America as a rural agrarian society with a weak central government where most power would rest in the hands of the states. So they had fundamentally conflicting views about the future of America. And their campaigns became basically campaigns of personal attack ads. So what this short video does is it takes, obviously there were no ads at the time. I mean, there were no television ads. Television didn't exist. But it takes their written publications, what they published about each other and said about each other in writing, and it puts it in the form of campaign advertisements for television. And they're pretty harsh attack ads, as you'll see. I should say that the language in them is pretty vicious, and just give a note about that. They attack each other's, their accusations about each other's ancestry, their accusations that, they're of mixed racial ancestry in the attack ads. There's all sorts of attacks and innuendos in their commentary, and these are taken from publications from the period. I think the most vicious campaign that I'm aware of in American history was actually Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams' campaign was incredibly vicious. And if you look at the John Quincy Adams was John Adams' son. If you look at their campaign, there were vicious attacks on both sides. John Quincy Adams' campaign accused Andrew Jackson's wife of being a bigamist, of being married to two men at the same time. And they called her all sorts of ugly names. They called her, a prostitute. They accused her of being, I won't repeat all the names that they called her, but you can imagine, perhaps, of being, immoral. That she was married to two men at the same time. When she was married to Andrew Jackson, she was married to another man, and this was published across all the headlines of the period. Now, Andrew Jackson's wife, Rachel Jackson, she ran off with Andrew Jackson when she was technically married to another man. But the story is actually much more complicated than that. Her husband was actually abusive towards her and ultimately abandoned her. Her husband left her, had been gone for some years, but had not formally divorced her. Women could not divorce their husbands. Only husbands could divorce their wives. So there's no way for a woman to initiate a divorce against her husband. So she had been abused and abandoned when she began her relationship with Andrew Jackson. Now, she couldn't legally marry Andrew Jackson because she was still legally married to her husband. So she runs off with Andrew Jackson, and they move to another town where no one knows Rachel, and they marry. Now, technically, she is still married to her first husband. So technically, she's married to two men at the same time. I don't think she regarded her first marriage as being a real marriage anymore for obvious reasons. And ultimately, a divorce is secured. I don't think she deserved all of the sort of abuse and the oppress that she got in that campaign. She was really the victim in that relationship, her first marriage. Certainly she didn't deserve to be attacked in this sort of vicious way in the press. And it's a kind of sign of the sexism that existed in the society at the time, that she had to endure that kind of treatment. She was, of course, mortified by this, um, and Jackson was infuriated, by the way. Um, and tragically, actually, Rachel Jackson died during the campaign. Andrew Jackson was embittered by this. Andrew Jackson was elected president, and he blamed his political opponents for his wife's death, essentially. Whether or not that's true or not, I mean, is hard to say. Um, did these attacks cause her distress and perhaps you know, aggravate her health problems? I mean, it's possible. Um, so, but it certainly was a very ugly campaign. Um, so, a bit about the political campaigns of the era. They were not the sort of high-minded exchange of ideals that we would like them to be necessarily, um, unfortunately. Um, so, um, I will say the video, I mean, I don't choose the content for the course. Um, there's one little criticism I have of the video. It shows a clip of President Obama commenting on how political campaigns are becoming increasingly divisive and how the rhetoric of campaigns is becoming more and more negative. And I think the video is a little, I think it comes across as being critical of President Obama, which I think is a bit unfair. Because I do think that political campaigns were more civil, in the 60s, 70s, 80s. That there was a period of somewhat greater civility, and things have gotten worse. So I do think, President Obama makes a fair point that in recent years our political campaigns have gotten less civil. I don't think he was referring to the political campaigns of the 1700s and early 1800s. So I think the clip, in a sense, sort of takes his comments out of context a bit. Um, so it's just my perspective, for what it's worth. Anyway, I look forward to working with you this week.